Good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you to today's event. My name is Lori Patton Davis, pronoun she, her, hers. And thank you all for joining in this first conversation in our Dear White People series. This initiative is sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies and the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Global Engagement. Each of these entities is housed in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University under the leadership of Dr. Don Pope Davis and in conjunction with the Dean's Racial Justice and Equity Task Force. The purpose of this dialogue series is to engage contemporary scholars on critical questions about whiteness and white supremacy in education, as well as strategies for disrupting rampant anti-Blackness in education. Each conversation revolves around a guiding question. And our first question of the series asks, what is whiteness and white supremacy in education, and how does it fuel anti-Blackness? Before we move into an introduction of our wonderful panelists, I want to share a few housekeeping points. Dr. Rhodesia McMillian, a Dean's Diversity Postdoctoral Fellow in our college, has graciously agreed to field questions for this conversation. As the conversation moves along, please type your questions in the chat box, and Dr. McMillian will partner with me to get as many of your questions answered during today's session. In addition, registered guests will receive an evaluation. Please complete the evaluation and provide feedback that will help us enhance future sessions in this series. Lastly, I want to specifically thank Dr. Noel Arnold, who leads our EDGE office in EHE, and Dr. Stephen Quay for partnering to conceptualize this series. Now, to get the conversation started, we are joined today by some amazing panelists, and Dr. Venus Evans-Winters, Dr. LaGarrett King, and Dr. TJ Stewart. I am super excited to be in conversation and in community with each of you today. So let's begin with some introductions. Venus, would you start us off?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation. This is a fabulous, fabulous panel. And as you know, Dr. Patton Davis, I just love being in space with you. Okay, this is the work that you've been doing, and you've been a great model and muse doing it. Also, Rhodesia, your lipstick is popping, so put it in the chat when you get a chance. Again, my name is Dr. Venus Evans-Winters. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a professor of education at Illinois State University in the Department of Educational Administration and Foundations. For the most part, I study and teach in the area of critical race theory, Black feminism or Black feminist thought, and social and cultural foundations of education and educational policy. So thank you again for having me here. I'm looking forward to being in dialogue with my colleagues today.
Thank you. LaGarrett?
Well, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Dr. LaGarrett King from the University of Missouri. I'm the Isabella Wade Leiter, Paul Leiter Professor of Education at the University of Missouri. I'm also the program lead for social studies education. My research centers around the teaching and learning of Black history, both in schools and society, as well as I study critical theories of race, critical multicultural teacher education, as well as curriculum history. I'm so delighted to be here, and I thank everyone for organizing this panel, and I'm ready to learn with and from everyone here. Thank you.
Dr. Stewart.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever the case may be for you. My name is TJ Stewart. He, him pronouns work for me. I'm an assistant professor in student affairs and higher education program at Iowa State University. My research broadly focuses on people and populations in the margins of the margins. Said differently, I look at people with hyper-marginalized identities, stigmatized identities, including college students engaged in sex work, fat bodies on campus, as well as sort of anti-Blackness and the race crit discourse. So how researchers and scholars talk about race to the detriment of Blackness and Black people. And I'm very pleased to be here and grateful for the invitation.
All right. Well, thank you all again for joining. So let's just get started, because I know as academics, we can do a lot of talking and we don't have a lot of time. So I want to just kind of jump into the first question. And one is that currently there's a lot of conversation and use of terminology such as whiteness, white supremacy, anti-Blackness. And given our current socio-political context, the words have kind of just been thrown around. I feel certain that not everyone knows what these words mean. And so I wonder if you all could help the audience unpack these terms and clarify, what is whiteness? What do we mean when we say it? What does white supremacy mean? What is anti-Blackness? What are these concepts? Let's start with you, TJ.
Sure, certainly. So for me, in terms of sort of whiteness and white supremacy, I think whiteness is sort of a set of logics, a set of values that are essentially put forward to dominate minoritized people. And sort of white supremacy is the structure that protects sort of whiteness, right, and allows it to kind of flourish. I get my sort of understanding of it from Bell Hooks, who talks about white supremacy as imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And she uses that language, so she says it's sort of her jargonistic way of not sort of elevating one issue over the other, but more importantly to say that it's all one big system happening all together at the same time. Said differently, when I say white supremacy, I'm also talking about capitalism. I'm also talking about patriarchy. I'm also sort of talking about imperialism, because those are white values. And so, we're talking about transphobia because we know the gender binary is deeply rooted in whiteness and white supremacy. That's not to say that we say white supremacy to erase or ignore those other terms, because specificity is important, but just to say that whiteness includes more than dominance around race, because systems are interlocking. In terms of Blackness or anti-Blackness, I kind of come from sort of the Afro-pessimist school of thought that sort of situates Black people in what they term as sort of the afterlife of slavery. Why that matters to my interest and why I think it should matter to lots of people is that then anti-Blackness then becomes very different than racism, and then is therefore different than what non-Black people of color specifically experience. And what Afro-pessimists say is that sort of slavery marks the ontological position of Black people, right? A living death. And so while other communities of color have often found their advocacy in trying to have an equal human designation, what anti-Blackness says is that Black people get a non-human designation, an inhuman designation. And so then thereby the ways that we are engaged, it's always a victimless violence, a victimless crime, because Black people aren't people. And so that is my sort of quick and dirty explanation of those terms, at least how I use them.
All right. Venus?
Wow, that's kind of hard to follow up.
Yeah, right.
TJ, can we finish with your lecture today? And so that was on point. So white supremacy evolved out of European imperialism. And I believe that's what Dr. TJ was talking about, right? So white supremacy evolved out of European imperialism. We cannot talk honestly about white supremacy without having also an understanding of Europeans' historical and contemporary quest for world domination and the US's current quest for world domination. And when we talk about world domination, we're talking about peoples, lands, and other natural resources, even now technologies, right? So entire histories, institutions, and cultural practices were put in place to maintain, to proliferate, and to solidify white supremacy as both a social, political, economic system, as well as a social, cultural, psychological system. And so that's why I always think about, and some of you all probably have witnessed me grappling with this, okay, should we really be centering white people and whiteness in a time of political uprise that's centering Black people? So language is a part of this, right? LaGarrett, right, TJ? We know this. Language is a part of white domination. Language is a part of white supremacist thought. And so I have this hashtag that I do on Twitter, Save Black English, right? So when we're talking about whiteness, it's almost again decentering Blackness, and it's okay to talk about whiteness, but we just have to be very conscientious of how we're talking about it, right? So we need to be intentionally also centering Blackness and Africanness if we want to push back against white supremacy. And that's very important because anti-Blackness is always centering of white people's needs, white people's ideas.
Thank you. I think that logically ties in with the work that LaGarrett does with Black history. So can you talk about your definitions and sort of how this also links to the work that you do?
Yeah, I think, TJ and Venice really explored this and really examined white supremacy and anti-Blackness, but anti-Blackness and white supremacy begins in the schoolhouse, right? Carter G. Woodson in 1933 and the miseducation of the Negro said there wouldn't be an anti-lynching movement, and lynching didn't start in the schoolhouse, right? And we can say that again with the Black Lives Matter movement. We wouldn't need a Black Lives Matter movement if Black lives mattered in the schoolhouse, right? So in many respects, we begin this white supremacy understanding, this anti-Black understanding through K-12 education. The first time that school children are introduced to Black people historically is through the narrative of enslavement, right? Through the narrative of oppression, right? Through the narrative of white domination, right? So here, as we talk about anti-Blackness, it's like, okay, well, you are forever a slave, right? And that's the essence of what TJ was saying in terms of this notion of anti-Blackness is always connected to slavery. Slavery is this ontological position, right, for Black people, right, looked upon. And this is not necessarily talking about owning or legally, owning someone, but it's that we don't have agency, right? We can't do anything, right? We can't breathe, right? We can't do these things, and white people have the power to assert their own rights, assert their own freedom, assert their consumption, destruction, and the simple dismissal of the Black people, quoting Michael Dumas, right? And that is what we do in K-12 education, is that we begin with enslavement and we continue to talk about Black people through dehumanizing aspects, eliminating, not really understanding Black joy, not understanding Black love, but we understand Black pain, Black suffering. And that all connects to this notion of understanding white supremacy, right? Because it gives the idea for white students that, hey, we hold dominion over you. And it gives the idea of Black people, hey, you are not human, right? So anything that we do to you, right? Because history shows that we can get away with it. We have the right to do it. And this is the way in which we understand our societies through our K-12 history curriculum.
I think that's a great example. I'm wondering, Venus, if you can respond to, aside from it sort of showing up in our K-12 schools and in the classroom early on, where there's this hidden curriculum of subordination, what other ways does, white supremacy show up in education and serve to pretty much disenfranchise Black people?
Yeah, it's interesting because my daughter woke up this morning because I've been working with a group of youth who are trying to understand, Black girls in particular, Black girls and young women who are trying to understand what's going on currently as far as, resistance to white supremacy, but also they're coping with a racial pandemic as well as a health pandemic and an economic crisis. And so and my daughter, she's only 14, but she's been hearing these conversations as I'm working with this group online. And we're looking at it from an intersectional perspective, right? Race and gender simultaneously, and age. And so she said today when I told her, I said, I'm going to be with a fabulous was Dr. Patton. And she said, so Mama, do white people have culture? Okay, do white people have culture? And I really want to, it's funny because, Dr. LaGarrett, he thinks about this from a school perspective, a schooling perspective, what's missing out of the curriculum. And when she said, do white people have culture? And I knew at that moment that she was saying it in a way that she was demonizing white people. And she was saying basically they steal from Black girls, right? So she's talking about cultural appropriation. But in my mind, and she knows that I operate from a Pan-African perspective, okay? So she knows this unapologetically. And so, but she's thinking about intersectionality alongside this Pan-African, Afrocentric, epistemology that we work from. And so she said, so do white people have culture? And I said, aha, right? So myself and my son said, you know what? It's like a fish out of water. A fish out of water. I said, the fact that you're asking that question it's an example of an evidence of that whiteness and white supremacy is all around us. It's the air that we breathe. And so when I think about white supremacy and anti-Blackness, white supremacy and white domination involves a set of social power relations constructed by whites so that they can receive social, political, and social economic material and non-material benefits. So within white supremacy, as a set of institutions, as a set of practices, as a body of curriculum, right? Black psychology and Black behavior are socially manufactured and labeled and controlled and judged, right? So whatever behaviors that are, and I'm thinking of Amos Wilson, right? I'm thinking of Amos Wilson in psychology, but whatever behaviors are beneficial and thoughts are beneficial and befitting to white authoritative or authoritarian control, right? The degree to which Black thought or behavior is perceived as servicing or disservicing, right, white hegemony, then that person or those people are considered to be bad or good, deficient or proficient, right, gifted, not gifted, normal or abnormal. And so hopefully I answered your question. So again, I got this, I think we all should do this because a lot of our young people and a lot of us are grown people, right? To use Black English, a lot of our young people and a lot of our grown people, we don't understand the power of white domination because it's a psychology and it's a lot of institutions put in place to control behavior. So Dr. Monique Morris, to get back to the point that I was making earlier, Dr. Monique Morris had an article that was released yesterday in US Today, talking about the state of Black girls and why we want police out of our schools. We want police out of our schools. We want police out of our schools because research shows that when it comes to Black people, Black boys and Black girls, especially who are disproportionately punished and criminalized in schools, that the more if we increase their chances of having contact with the police, chances are things don't only escalate, but it also increases their chances of being pushed into the criminal justice system, okay? So they become institutionalized. And so we have to think about that, right? So not just sets of behaviors and attitudes, ways of thinking, but also who's punished and who's rewarded for aligning themselves with white supremacy.
Wow. Okay. I just want you all to know that I am listening and hinging on every word you say and trying to process. I know if I'm trying to process, our audience is also trying to process this. I have appreciated the examples you provided, and I'm wondering, TJ, if you can talk about what this looks like within a higher ed context. So we have the K-12 context. We have what this looks like if as we think about criminalization and the school to prison pipeline and what it means, I guess, on an an intersectional framework. But what does this look like in higher ed when we talk about white supremacy and anti-Blackness?
Sure. I mean, I think, in higher education, I think we sort of convince ourselves that we don't mirror the same sort of problematic logics that exist in the society more broadly, right? We are enlightened, like we get it, therefore we are sort of further along. And I think we often sort of reproduce those very same logics. I mean, it happens through curriculum, who we assign and who we teach and why. People will often then say, well, there aren't any Black scholars that did that work. Well, don't you think it would be important to problematize that in your course? We do it through our research. And I think, when we talk about white supremacy and anti-Blackness, they're very two highly sophisticated forms of dominance, right? I often talk about people say racism is just kind of clumsy. It's real easy and easy for people to engage in. But sort of when we start to think about anti-Blackness, it starts to become a little bit more covert and hard to detect. So we do it in research, right? I think about intersectionality and how it's the most co-opted, misused, and abused term probably of the decade in terms of how we think about the epistemological frames put forward by, for, and about Black women, but then we have all these articles that don't talk about their material conditions in any meaningful way. In 2017, Kimberly Crenshaw said that of intersectionality, that it's not just about Black women, but it's never not about them either. And so having sort of these frameworks in our research through policy, all of you may be familiar with Students for Fair Admission. Ed Bloom has been sort of working with trying to essentially attack affirmative action and race-conscious admissions. You might remember Abby Fisher from a few years ago, who lost her case against the Texas university system because she said she was discriminated against because of race-conscious admissions. Well, when that did not work, then Ed Bloom said, well, I'm going to find Asian and Asian American students who were excluded from higher education as a way to have a new litigant, a person of color, to then say, this is problematic. But what's implicit in that is, well, we don't want Black folks to have access to higher education in any meaningful material way. And then once they do get there, they still have violent experiences. There's still gaps. We often talk about in higher education, which just grinds my gears, about equal opportunity, but we have no focus on equal outcomes. And so we don't, when we have outcomes that don't match equitably across racial identities, that's not something we're interested in, because we at least sort of created the opportunity. We have the bridge programs, we have the scholarship programs, but there's no structural change to how to bring Black students into the fold. I also think it happens because when we have Black people in specific places, then it then becomes the great equalizer to, okay, well, racism is clearly over. We got a Black president and a Black VPSA, and we have a Black department chair, and we got a Black this and a Black that. So then therefore we allow ourselves to be convinced that everything is good to go, and it's really not. And so a lot of ways, I think higher education, we've really bought into sort of this neoliberal ethic that has really sort of stained our opportunities to really create sort of liberating institutions, if that's possible, right? Yang talks about there can be no decolonial university, but it could be decolonizing, as in there can be people doing work actively to try to undo, but we have those violent systems, and it starts in K-12, as my colleagues have said, and it never truly stops, even if students do matriculate, so.
Wonderful. So I think if, we're trying to sum this up, to me, what I'm pulling from what you're saying, one, that when we talk about whiteness and white supremacy, it's pretty much everywhere. It's in our structures, it's in the curriculum, it's in the policy. So it's sort of there. And I think, Venus, to your point about your daughter asking, do white people have culture? That's a question that comes up all the time. I think for some white people who don't see themselves as having a culture, which is in, a very real way, an outcome of being taught that you are the default, you are the norm. So anything else has to be labeled, anything else is, the Black college, the Black cultural, like all of these other things are named in, as an extension of the default of whiteness. So I'm wondering, as we think about the term, specifically white supremacy, some people, primarily white people, I'll say this, find white supremacy off-putting, right? Because so much of that has been connected with the KKK. Can one of you sort of, help to unpack that so that our audience understands that, yes, there's the, overt KKK, and then there's also the very subtle. What do those subtle ways of white supremacy look like, the ones that are almost unrecognizable? And it takes scholars like us, it takes, critical writings, it takes education to really sort of pull it out Venus?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
I'll go back to the original operationalization of white supremacy, right? Because I think too, because most of us work in institutions of higher education, and we always are thinking about the sensitivity of words, but words are powerful. And I'm going to step on LaGarrett's toes right now. But one main aspect of white supremacy is the idea of European, what we call historiography. So who gets to tell history and who gets to shape history? So so this is why we have to go back again to European imperialism. That was a project. So what we're seeing now is the global north, or the United States, trying to, again, TJ pointed out, Bell Hooks talks about racism, white supremacy, imperialism, patriarchy, capitalism, right? So those are all interlocking systems that influence what we do. I saw that somebody put in the chat, for example, yes, we need to hold institutions accountable. I think the one primary aspect of white supremacy and white domination that Dr. LaGarrett and TJ are saying is that, keep in mind, these institutions weren't meant for us. European imperialism was built upon science, putting in place certain institutions, including religious institutions. And I know that we have a very diverse audience, but a part of pushing back constantly against European historiography is understanding that the very philosophies and ideologies and sciences that our institutions were built on make it very, very difficult for us to have equal outcomes, because they were meant to control us. And if we weren't easily controlled, whether again, psychologically and or behavior, right, then, then we will be punished and disciplined. Okay, so I think that some things that we're contemplating from, again, Dr. Patton, like you said, from research perspectives, our writings, our organizing efforts, even when you put one or two of us in these spaces, I don't care if it's women and gender studies, I don't care if it's in special education, I don't care if it's in social foundations of education, we automatically look disruptive. We look disruptive. Now, what's interesting is we're not as disruptive as our white colleagues think, or the white power structures, nor are we as disruptive as some of us grown people think, some of us educated people. Truly, we wouldn't be here if we were that disruptive to white supremacy thought, right? And so once we understand that, we will have to also accept that we're going to have to decolonize the institutions, right? We have to decenter whiteness and recenter Blackness, Africanness, and other indigenous ways of being and doing. Otherwise, we're always going to be in a state of consciousness. We're always going to experience this type of racial battle fatigue, and we're always going to see dis-ease. I like to say, Dr. Patton, the reason why you are my role model and muse, to be honest with you, is because something that we very rarely admit publicly, but this is about to go out to 1,200 people.
Oh my goodness.
Us who do adapt to these institutions, right? And I'm saying adapt because also I'm a clinical psychotherapist, right? And so I want to be clear. Some of us who adapt, we actually are increasing our chances of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and also depression and anxiety, okay? And so there are real psychological consequences. And so some of this healing stuff, I just took a call from someone at a university in the Midwest, and I've been receiving these calls for weeks now, right? So what's happening is that as we attempt to shift these institutions heads on, the institutions and the systems and our colleagues of all hues, all racial, ethnic backgrounds, they're going to have to understand we're going to need time to recoup. We need time to recoup. I don't know how that looks. Maybe it's less coursework, maybe it's semesters off, maybe it's more paid sabbaticals and leaves, because we know that we're pushing against an institution that was built upon the colonizations of certain peoples, and that's Black and brown people.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wonder if LaGarrett, if you could talk a little bit about how white people unwittingly perpetuate anti-Blackness, even in their efforts to resist it. I believe there are plenty of our white colleagues who are on this call who are really genuinely seeking ways to better understand what it is, how it shows up. From your perspective, how do they perpetuate it, even as they're trying to resist it?
So I think in three ways, right? So one is only presenting change cosmetically, right? Where we are willing to put a Black face within particular spaces, right? As TJ mentioned a little bit, you know, Black department chair, Black this, Black that, Black head, or whatever the case may be. But there's no intent to transform or even kind of give up that particular privilege that you may have, right? Even we look at social institutions like, you know, the NFL, right? You know, singing the Black national anthem on the first game. It's like, okay, what does that do to kind of the bottom line, right? You know, yes, that's nice and such and everything, but what are we doing to transform, right? And in many respects, you know, Black people really don't want any of that, because sometimes we're feeling like, man, now you co-opting our stuff, right? So now you're co-opting our stuff, right? Black National Anthem, Juneteenth, right? So so now there's going to be a bunch of people with Frederick Douglass shirts on June 19th, 18th, so now you're like, okay, all right, are you co-opting things? And it's nice, you know, but where is that kind of transformation, you know, coming from? And then two, you know, a lot of times white people become over paternalistic now. Right, you know, so now they infuse themselves within Black spaces in the form of beginning to help per se, right? And last, you know, this notion of, to add on, you know, to the last comment, this notion of nice white people, right? Someone in the, you know, comments said white saviorism, right? Right, nice white people have sometimes been very complicit in, you know, expanding white supremacy or giving a pass to white supremacy, because they're cowards to talk against those particular racist structures, despite the fact that they consider themselves not racist, or some people may consider themselves anti-racist, but they're not fighting against. They're presenting this cowardly kind of approach, right? So when all the George Floyd stuff was happening, I received on social media and emails letters from students. Oh, Dr. King, you really opened our eyes when we were in the classroom. Oh, you really challenged us. And, you know, these are, you know, alumnus. But I remember being in the class and all I received on my teaching evals were bad reports. Like, oh, all he does is talk about race. Oh my gosh, he didn't teach anything about social studies. He didn't teach anything about, you know, teaching or whatever the case may be. But 5 years later, now it's, oh, thank you for teaching us this. And while we can understand that there's, you know, a learning curve, right? There's teacher capacity, and maybe these, you know, students were resistant during the time, and now they figure out like, okay, well now, or even if they were supportive, they didn't speak up in those particular, you know, spaces. So therefore, allowing, you know, Black people to continue to suffer because they don't speak up against, you know, whiteness or white supremacy. And we saw that in our last presidential, you know, election. You listen to people and, oh, I don't agree with everything he says. I don't agree with everything. Why you voted for him, right? You know what I'm saying? So yet you're giving that a pass based on a person who has talked about, who has, you know, said some racist aspects, ableism aspects, all these particular aspects in our country. And we can go back to slavery where, you know, a lot of people would say, hey, not all white people own slaves. Actually, a small percentage of people own slaves. But guess what? You didn't speak against the system. You were fine with the system because it didn't, or at the very least, you were apathetic, right? So those are kind of the ways in which, people can cause harm, right? Despite the fact that they're trying to do well and try to do good.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, to LaGarrett's point, it's complicated. And that's why I think we all emphasized, right, this, and the question was about white supremacy, because, you know, people are very, very comfortable with this word. You know, the phrase, I'm not a racist. Now people are saying, I'm a white ally, right? Or as LaGarrett said, they would come forward and they would speak on behalf of Black people issues or against, you know, anti-Blackness. But in a climate, you know, in the water, again, fish in water, in the body of water called white supremacy, that white ally, you know, that's why some of us say, let's please get rid of that word too, right? Like, let's get it. Some people are saying white conspirators, like we should be talking about conspirators, co-conspirators, because what happens is, even in these institutions and systems, right, we can talk about the criminal justice system. We can talk about education, higher education in particular, that as soon as a white person comes forward and centers themselves and their policies, again, the focus is on whiteness. So a part of decolonizing these institutions is that white people have to be comfortable with decentering. Fall back, homie. Mm-hmm. Fall back, because you will actually profit. You will profit from our struggles. So we have to, I mean, so that's a major part of it. So co-conspirators is really working in the background, and you are tearing stuff down, dismantling from the inside out as a co-conspirator.
Right. Thank you. I think that's really important to know, you know, as a white person, when to be a part of the conversation and when to be absent from it. TJ, you know, this series is called Dear White People, but how might members of minoritized groups at times perpetuate anti-Blackness in education? And why do you think this happens?
Sure. I think that the spoiler alert is for the same reasons that white people do it, but perhaps for different reasons. I think to your question, I think, you know, speaking directly to the POCs or people who have a minoritized identity, right? I think that it is seductive. Anti-Blackness is seductive. It promises a ticket for admission on the plane of white supremacy, but what people don't realize is that even if you're allowed to get on, you're still gonna pay for the ticket and you're still gonna be flying coach. And I think that, for me, multiculturalism has been probably the way that non-Black people of color have engaged most significantly, because it is on surface seemingly very helpful and not harmful. Because what it does is it's rooted in this idea that embracing more than white is good, even if it's still anti-Black, if you follow where I'm going. And so on surface, we live in a society that is anti-racist, right? Not that I believe that, but what I'm saying is, like, the position of the state is that racism is bad, racism is wrong. And so then therefore that inclusion then makes sort of things right. Janine Young Kim, she's a legal scholar, and she wrote an article called Are Asians Black? The Asian American Civil Rights Agenda and the Contemporary Significance of the Black-White Paradigm. And so the reason why that paradigm is important to non-Black people of color, and we think about their engagement in anti-Blackness, is because it's a rejection of saying, well, I'm not Black, I'm not white, this doesn't speak to my experience, so I don't have to care about it. But then they then go off and then still perpetuate those sort of same logics. And so while a paradigm might be problematic, a continuum isn't, right? And so how we start to bring back into conversation Blackness and whiteness in non-Black people of color communities is important, because to not do that, you erase the foundation and the roof of white supremacy. And then you're sort of stuck with sort of this incomplete picture. And for me, that is important to think about. An example that she uses in that piece, in terms of that people of color were intentionally stratified, was during Reconstruction. Chinese laborers were imported to the United States, essentially, to work on the railroads. What a lot of people don't know is that the white ruling class and business owners had a very intentional decision to make it known that Chinese laborers were preferred to Black laborers, whether they were free or enslaved. And what that does is that it further denigrates Black people, but it also makes Chinese laborers the new subordinate class. But what it did is it put Chinese folks in between Black and white. And so it puts them on this sort of new continuum. And so we have to start to think about how, in what ways, when we embrace multiculturalism as the only way to think about equity and justice, how that is really perpetuating anti-Blackness, because sort of white supremacy's embrace of non-Black people of color is facilitated and fueled by anti-Blackness, hard stop. And it's exactly because it's inclusive of more than white. Therefore, on the surface, it seems to agree, or at least not violate, the logics of living in a non-racist society. And so I think that it becomes very easy, it becomes seductive, and then I can approximate myself as close to whiteness and as far away from Blackness as possible, and then be rewarded for that positioning. And so it's insidious, and I think that it's one of those things that often I tell people in equity and justice work, despite the struggles that are important to them, if you don't have a radical Black politic, whether you're Black or not, then are you truly invested in liberation? Not because Black is more important, not because that it should trump every other issue, but that if you don't get anti-Blackness right, then liberation is not possible. And so those are just some of the things that come up for me when I think about non-Black people of color specifically.
And TJ, sometimes I get in trouble because I actually stated that very explicitly. I've actually said that Black people do not need multicultural education. Black children need African and African American education. White people need multicultural education.
So this is good. In terms of thinking about this education, we're all in colleges and schools of education. And for us, we're unique because it's College of Education and Human Ecology. So we have human sciences as a part of our college. And so when we think about holistic learning and holistic development, what does this education look like? What you just mentioned, Venus, this multicultural education for, white students, white colleagues. What's the role of the entities where, we do our research, teaching, and service? What should we be doing? The first thing that sort of pops into my mind is what does teacher education look like, and how do we prepare, people to be solid educators who know how to teach in a way that values Black lives? But what are some of you all's, recommendations for colleges of education or education in human ecology? I'll start with you, Venus.
I think that, again, I'm borrowing from Dr. Amos Wilson, and also Marimba Yani, and also Dr. Asa Hillard. Okay, and also Dr. Joyce King has also a great book, A Framework for Black Education. And I think this is a framing issue. Lori, and that we need to shift our frameworks. And so a lot of white supremacy involves, again, the dismantling of other cultures and other peoples, not only their way of life, but also their knowledges. And so from a psychological perspective, because you're in a interdisciplinary college, so we can talk about this from an interdisciplinary perspective. So we actually have to remember, recall, and recollect the history of African people and Black people in the US and across the African diaspora. And so we know that there's a strong relationship, and I just cited Black people. I want to be intentional in saying that. You all have heard me cite Black people, okay? So we need Black education, and also a part of dismantling white supremacy in higher education and right, from 0 to 3 and pre-K through K-12 and 22, is that we also have to interrupt and mitigate epistemic apartheid. So I know white education. I just want to be clear, and I know other people's education. What we don't know is African and African people's education. But a part of psychological warfare is this institutionalization and the so-called validation and legitimation of European historiography. So what we're doing as scholars, and what we need to be teaching the next generation, again, all racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds, but specifically Black and brown people and indigenous people across the diaspora, is the recovery, remembering, right? And the recollection of African history, so that we can start again, an African historiography. Those are tied to a psychological construct. So think about it this way: how your people have been portrayed historically, what you have been taught about your people historically, and how you've been taught to think about yourself. It actually influences your psychology. Y'all, this is not myth. This is not hyperbole. I'm in two fields, right? I'm in education and I'm a highly qualified clinician, meaning that I know how the mind works. So the mind as well as the brain, okay? And so that's the part that, I mean, this is interesting to me. So when, you know, on social media, everybody was talking about the health pandemic. You all didn't know this, but behind closed doors, most of us who are clinicians and recognized by the state and the governments as highly qualified clinicians, that means we got a lot of training, we worked with a lot of people, do not understand that the way that our what we read, who talks to us, who's put before us, also are experiencing crises. So these governments, the medical field, the World Health Organization, the CDC, also said we are in a state of a mental health crisis. Mm-hmm. Mental health crisis that's disproportionately affecting those people who have been hit by historical pandemics. So one thing that I always try to center again in these conversations around education, right, and white supremacy and decolonizing education is the fact that the CDC and the World Health Organization gets to decide, they decide what's a pandemic. Right? So you can have an issue that's considered only, it has to be affecting the world. Okay, so it has to be, for something to become a pandemic, it has to be affecting the world. So that's actually, it's also a social construction. Now keep in mind that Black people in America, we have encountered many pandemics. Remember the HIV/AIDS pandemic? We recall that. Right? We're now, it just so happened racism is a pandemic, but because it doesn't inflict everybody, it's not considered a pandemic, right? But we also, so there's simultaneously, we are experiencing a mental health crisis alongside a racial pandemic and a health pandemic, but certain people get to decide it. So we have to start rebuilding an African or African-American historiography in order to build up the self-esteem of our young people and some of our grown people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I just want you all to know I'm getting text messages and things in the chat box about how amazing your perspectives have been. So LaGarrett, what about K-12 schools in addressing whiteness and white supremacy and anti-Blackness? Like what seems logical? Some of the questions, there have been too numerous to name, but I've seen some of the things, some of the questions in the chat box where people are, you know, saying I'm a superintendent, you know, I'm in a rural community. I want to shift, you know, the conversation, you know, how can I do that? You know, like what are your thoughts on this, your recommendations?
So a key K-12 initiative now is this notion that all teachers need to be literacy teachers, right? To move up the literacy rates. But in actuality, all teachers need to be history teachers as well, right? And understanding the histories of their communities, to understand the histories of the racialized aspects of their students, right? I want to piggyback on Dr. Winter and say, whenever we attempt to do kind of this multiculturalism, all we do is kind of center, you know, whiteness, right? You know, all it is, you know, white history and blackface, right? We include a Black person within the narrative, but the narrative continues. We don't alter and change the narrative because Black people's histories, right, are totally different than white people's histories, right? I argue this all the time, that what is historically important to white people is not historically important to Black people. So in really kind of examining and understanding notions of diversity within those particular spaces comes with learning. Right? Rich Milder has this notion of, you know, start where you are, but don't stay there, right? So it comes with learning, right? Learning, major professional development. We can't hide behind, I'm teaching a curriculum. You're not teaching a curriculum, you're teaching citizens. So what is that knowledge that these citizens need to increase and enhance our democracy. And if it's the same Eurocentric narrative, then we are creating citizens that are going to still uphold white supremacist knowledge, right? And still continue to promote anti-Blackness within our society. So that's one, right? And in centering, Black history, we need to change this notion of that Black history is American history, because what that does is center Eurocentrism as well, right? Particularly when we center, notions of white people and just add these particular people in there. Black people have their own entry points. They have their own people that they celebrate. They have their own cultural celebrations and all these particular aspects that need to be imbued within all of K-12 education and not just one time a year. But yeah, so it starts with education, right? For the teachers. I listened to a student the other day that cried at this wealthy school district in St. Louis and saying, I'm tired of hearing y'all saying y'all don't know anything. It's not my job to teach you. It's your job to teach me. So get it together, right? Mm-hmm. That's one. Advocate for the voiceless, right? Particularly for, your Black students and your Black parents that may not know or can navigate those educational spaces, and school systems have to step up. We have to invest in professional development. We have to hold our teachers accountable, right? To promoting diverse education, to promote Afrocentric lenses within, the educational system. We have to do that. So those are the three things, right? The learning, advocate for the voiceless, as well as school systems need to step up and invest in teachers' understanding and hold them accountable for these particular situations.
Thank you. So before we transition into a larger set of Q&A, I want to ask one final question, and perhaps we'll start with you, TJ. What's one thing you want the listeners to know or to walk away either reflecting on, maybe it's something you think they should read, something that they need to do to make what they've learned today actionable? What is one recommendation that you will offer to our audience?
Sure. I mean, I think being able to engage in the literature and the ideas, I know that sometimes that seems exhausting, sometimes it can seem inaccessible, but if you don't engage with the epistemological frames, then you really don't have the language to understand what's happening to you. Bell Hooks talks about how she went to theory because she was hurting, right? And so theory then became a way for her to make meaning of the pain and that she was experiencing. So I say, whether it's for Black folks, non-Black people of color, or white folks, is that sometimes you have to go there, but don't stay there. So Denise Da Silva said that, we cannot stay in the work of critique, but we must go through critique to get to the work. And so, this sort of notion of sort of once you know better, you do better. But I think there's a lot of insidious ways that anti-Blackness shows up. And so, because it is seductive, I think, this idea of meritocracy is anti-Black. Gatekeeping policies that don't specify race, but limit the participation of Black people in society and in education are problematic. Maybe the work is getting rid of the GRE. Lots of programs are doing that. Maybe the work is lobbying for different requirements for credentialing of teachers. We talked about African historiography, to go over to the continent and to ask them the question, what makes a good teacher? There was this concept some scholars and I developed called just knowing, because the answer was always, you can see it. You just know when there's a good teacher, but that would never fly here, right? You got to go here, you got to study this, you got to take the practice, so what are the systems and structures and credentialing and policies that are put in place that limit us for thinking more broadly about radical education for minoritized people, specifically for Black people? And so I think that whether you are of the let's burn it all down camp of revolution, or whether you are of the people have needs today, so we need to do something in the interim, be somewhere and be doing some work, and being able to have that outcome to show evidence of that work, I think, is key.
Thank you. How about you, Venus?
Again, I'm gonna piggyback off of everything the brothers have said. I agree. Okay, so I'm always thinking about the frameworks, and I'm glad that TJ reminded us about hooks in theory, because I think sometimes that Black people, especially Black women, we could become the mules of education, to cite Zora Neale Hurston, where they want us to give the reading list, they want us to hold the circles, right? They want us to be ahead of the diversity committee, right? But then we get those poor evaluations and we get paid less. We get more courses and we have to do more for students, which many of us, because again of our ontological, being that we're going to want to be in service too. We just have to be more conscious of not becoming the mules or the mammies of academia or education. And so this is a framework that I use. So the framework that I use is AIDD, AIDD. Aid. And I like to say in Black English and African American English vernacular, we don't want your aid. Because I'm in the chat, we don't want your aid, okay? And so you can translate that. But basically, so aid is alienation. And I'm citing Fanon because people are asking for citations as well, or readings. But I'm citing Fanon and Derek Bell in particular, and Mimi. Okay, so we don't want your aid. Alienation, inferiorization, deculturalization, and dehumanization. That's what we're going up against. So when I was growing up, and I'm not going to age myself, y'all here, I'm not going to tell y'all my age, even though LaGarrett gave it away. I'm like, what son? Who are you talking about? Right? So, but when I was growing up in schools, do y'all remember this, right? And the focus was on like physical education. Now remember, all of this is coming along at the same time of desegregation, right? De jure education, right? Or de jure education, de facto education, to desegregate our schools, et cetera, et cetera. And I just got caught up because I'm trying to go fast. But anyway, when we was growing up, there was this big focus on physical education, right? So I was that little skinny girl, the one that was short, but I didn't win any other physical tests. But I'm gonna tell y'all the secret. I used to practice during the summer, that little hang thing, the hanging test. And I used to practice in my closet because my goal was to win that competition. But the US government, after desegregation, because of all of the backlash that it had, because of its racism while they were speaking out against, other regimes like the apartheid regime in South Africa, the US government had to desegregate its schools. That's a short history lesson. And so when it desegregated the schools, they thought about how can we exploit this situation? Now, remember, Black people were dominating the Olympics, and the Black athletes were like resisting to like white domination and Black power. So they said, you know what? And so people thought that focus then on physical education was innocent. It wasn't. The US wanted to dominate militarily, right? Bring out the strongest people, right? They also wanted to dominate in the Olympic space, right? And so there was this focus on physical education, ingraining us early. But then I woke up one day, and then it was like this focus then on SEL, social emotional learning, right? And so now that's the new twist in ed. So let's also now, and remember, PE is being wiped out. Through all the standardized tests, they need more curriculum to get the kids ready for the test. So there's been this new focus on SEL, social emotional learning. But all of this is connected. So now really what they're asking the young people is to adapt to psychopathology. Adapt to psychopathology, because remember, a part of white supremacy domination is that those people, and this includes, Black and brown people and indigenous people too, anybody is moving away from that spectrum of the ideal normative white, right? Then the more pathological and deficient you become. It's a stratum, right? It's about sorting and categorizing. And so now any child that does not fit within that SEL box based off of white supremacist idea of who a student, a citizen, and human being should be, then they're labeled, they're categorized, they're sorted, and treated. So be very careful in this new era of trauma-informed education. We have to ask who's doing the assessing and who's doing the diagnosing. Okay. What are we asking our kids to adapt to? Right? So in short, changing our frameworks, as everybody has pointed out, but also aid. I don't want your aid. Alienation, from the curriculum and from society, period. Inferiorization, feeling less than, right? And deculturalization, where they're stripping Black and brown kids of who they are in their home environments, but also this dehumanization, because dehumanization becomes Breonna Taylor and police officers shooting into sleeping people's homes, but also white officers or police officers in general putting a knee while being filmed on a human being's neck. But because we've been taught that this is not even a human being, or these aren't human beings, you can get away with it, or it's normalized. So we don't want your aid.
All right, that is very clearly stated. Dr. King, what's your piece that you would like the audience to walk away with today?
Yeah, just really quick. Continue to learn, right? And while we are learning, utilize your students, right? Utilize the knowledge of your communities, your parents, to help kind of bring fresh new information to your students, to yourself, right? Please do not be contentious with the particular community, but bring communities in, bring parents in, use your student knowledge to really expand our knowledge. So I'm gonna be real quick with that.
Wonderful. All right, so we have had quite a few questions being directed toward things that you all have said throughout our conversation. And I'll just ask a few, and I don't know, you can, if whoever feels most comfortable, answering it, please do jump in here. One is from a teacher who is talking about the process of grading papers and correcting students with proper English. And this comes from some things that you said, Venus. But she was saying she faces, I don't know, I assumed it was a woman, but that was Rhodesia. Okay. Whoever this person is, when they look at their students' work, they correct it based upon proper English, right? And I think the question is sort of hinting at, is proper English institutionally ingrained racism? That's the first part of the question. And should teachers be correcting student writing to adhere to proper English if, the assumption is that it is a form of racism, perhaps a, microaggressive behavior? What's your thoughts on this? Anybody?
Briefly, I would say look at the work of Dr. Lisa Delpit. She talks about language and language's domination. She has a couple books on it. The Tongue We Speak, I believe, is the title of one, and the other one is Other People's Children, where she talks about teaching the culture of power. So I'll just leave it there, and then I think that you have to decipher it from your lens. I don't know if, I'll just leave it.
Okay. And I, as we've been talking, I've listed some of the authors that you all have mentioned. Hopefully we can have some sort of resource page. I think one of the challenges with people trying to, really understand all of, what you all have shared. I mean, it's just deep information. It's a lot of information, especially if you're unfamiliar with the literature. But people always want to read. And I think when people think about educating themselves, it is, well, what can I read first? I think what's most popular these days is How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility. And certainly people can use those as resources, but I think the works that you all have mentioned will provide people with the framing that Venus mentioned, and a way to really begin to take hold to some of these concepts and what they actually mean, like when it's being enacted in your life, and you have a framing or some language to better understand, what you're doing, what's actually happening.
And I would suggest, Dr. Lori, that if people want to get out of their comfort zone, instead of, well, in addition to reading White Fragility, if you want to get out of your comfort zone, also read White Rage. It's written by a Black woman scholar, White Rage. So that's the one that I've been recommending, either to complement White Fragility or to supplement it.
Okay. Another question is, how does white supremacy persist through secondary education in which students are discouraged by degree programs from undertaking studies in the humanities and social sciences? And also, I've been reading this, and it's interesting to me because my perspective on this question is that many students of color, racially minoritized students, are discouraged from STEM, discouraged from math, discouraged from the sciences, so that when we get to college, there you see the STEM fields virtually all white, or not many Black students in those fields. What do you all have thoughts about this particular question?
Well, the first thing that came to mind, so I saw a little different. Like there's a lot of these STEM schools like popping up in predominantly Black areas, but then I kind of think of James Anderson's, the education of Black folk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, his classic and seminal text, where is like the type of education they're getting is not necessarily the form of education that's needed to really be in that particular profession, right? Those high-paying professions, but just basic programming, right? So for me, it's all about just kind of examining, well, what type of STEM education are we talking about, right? And I can definitely see students, particularly students of color, being Black students, being pushed away from the type of STEM that's critical, the type of STEM that helps out their communities in transformative ways, and just being put in these kind of menial, like low-level aspects of STEM. But that's the first thing that came to mind for me.
Anybody else?
I also think there's a material component to it as well. I think sort of discouraged, sometimes the implication is that there was some encouragement to begin with. And I think that how we think about showing students that programs are for them and the possibilities, but also, again, because power is interlocking and happening together at the same time, so many students come to college thinking, what is going to be the best opportunity for me to make money? I know plenty of students who started in bio. I know plenty of students who started in chemistry, or who tried to go into STEM, or who didn't want to do Africana studies, African American studies, because there's no money there. What are you going to do with that degree? And so all of that is abiding by this capitalistic logic that, your degree is supposed to be a good that's supposed to be towards some sort of end for you to be able to make money. And so the reality is that even when students get STEM degrees, they get social science degrees, there's still income inequity when they get out, right? And so I think in some ways we have to start asking some deeper questions. We invite students, we have scholarship programs, but then we still have racist curriculum. We still have racist faculty members and professors, and we know the curriculum works very different in higher ed than it does in K through 12. To tell faculty what they can and cannot teach, who they should and should not assign or cite, right? That looks very different for us. And so I think really starting to be able to have some of those conversations of, well, what does this education provide for me? There was this big question when people were saying, well, should we drop testing, or what are grades? Well, wouldn't you want your doctor to have gone through the testing? No, I want my doctor to have developed critical thinking skills so that when I'm opened up on the table, he can make a good decision if things go wrong. And right, so how we start to think differently about what education is and what it could be, but not did he pass all the tests and I still flatline on the table. And so I think that those are some things to start to really disrupt is, well, what is higher education or college for? Because then for a lot of students, that's dictating what I pursue. What are the possibilities for me on the other side of degree if I get it?
All right. Thank you.
I remember in, I think it was 2000, maybe it was 2005 or maybe it was 2008, I can't remember. I went back and forth to South Africa, but I had the opportunity to go to South Africa with Dr. Anita Ball. And I'm purposely saying these names, Lori, so that, the audience can hear some alternative scholars' names from the mainstream curriculum. But Dr. Anita Ball out of Stanford and Dr. Carol Lee out of Northwestern University. we took a trip to South Africa. And what happened in South Africa under the apartheid regime is that because of entrenched eugenicism and racism and white supremacy, they just woke up one day and they did not have enough Black people to become teachers, K-12 teachers, early childhood teachers, and higher ed teachers. But in that, they literally wiped out the pipeline, right? So what happened is they knew that they would wake up, or they had woken up to a country, a nation where they didn't have any engineers to like rebuild the roads or rebuild the bridges. And so when I hear about the US government and private corporations suddenly wanting to focus on STEM, the first thing that comes to my mind is STEM for who and STEM for what? So is it STEM to further use tools and technologies of the state to oppress or to capitalize off of Black people, right? Or is it STEM for that's trying to recruit Black boys and girls into STEM for the purposes of rebuilding and building our communities, right? Mm-hmm. To corrupt medical apartheid, to prevent these diseases and these pandemics from inflicting us disproportionately? Is it to put stop signs in our community so our kids don't have to, they won't be hit by cars when crossing the street and then ticketed for jaywalking? Is it to put in place sidewalks, right? Is it to put in place other infrastructures like bridges? So I'm always interested in STEM for whom and STEM for what. And it's not a secret, right, Dr. Patton, you know this, that a lot of times when people want to do STEM, especially with Black girls in mind, they will ask me to come on and consult now from a Black feminist or critical race feminist perspective. And these are the conversations that we have, right? So that's, if we're gonna, I don't know if I can say this publicly. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, y'all, but I'm like a runaway slave. So there you go. I was invited to Facebook, for example, to have a conversation around ethics. And it was a small cadre of people, including some Nobel Prize winners, believe it or not. And so I'm there, and I'm one of a few Black people and people of color in particular. And I remember that one thing I was shocked by is something we take for granted. Remember 10, 15 years ago, we would walk into the airport bathroom. And I know this was happening with the women, but we would put our hands under the water faucet and it didn't work. And you're sitting there and you're like, what? You looking around. And so it comes to find out that was an issue. So you had these young white boys, 2021, who are brilliant in their field, right? So what they did is with these sensors, they did not account for skin complexion. We know that these technologies also are being used in the police state too, right? So racial profiling, images, who looks like they're going to commit a crime. But with this epidermalization or this technology, and the white guys are just telling me, we didn't think about it. And I said, so imagine that. I know how I felt. I'm surrounded by, white women or white people, and I'm trying to get this technology to work, but now I look stupid. I look like I don't know how to use technology. Now, remember, I come from a traumatized people who have been traumatized, so anxiety goes up. I'm starting to panic. People are looking at me. So there are real life consequences to Black people being excluded, marginalized, and isolated and segregated from STEM fields.
Something you said just reminded me of Mario Matsuda's work in terms of looking to the bottom. Like if we start from the most vulnerable populations, when we think about our policies, when we think about our practices, if we could start from the community or the people who are most vulnerable and customize it for them so that they can be successful, then we all win. But it's very rarely that we look from that perspective. And I think that's, one of the ways that happens. One of the attendees wants to know, you all to comment on navigating the space between, following Black leadership and decentering whiteness, and then doing the work of learning, white people doing the work themselves of learning without putting extra burden on Black educators. So they're saying white people have been raised to believe, and their experiences have reinforced that if they just have good intentions and work hard, they will help. And they don't even think to question if they are going about their learning effectively. So what's the navigational piece between, falling back, and, allowing, space for Black leadership versus actually doing the work?
I mean,
TJ?
there's a couple different things that come up for me. I think going back to sort of what is the intent and what do you have potentially to gain from it. I think if there's an opportunity to gain, whether that is materially, economically, or otherwise, those may be places an opportunity to have Black people involved and engaged as a way to be able to sort of pay that work and do that work forward. But I think I think it's a very important idea, this idea, well, if I have good intentions, try to do the right thing, then, I'll be headed sort of in the right direction. But as my late mother said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I don't think that that's enough, but that really committing yourself to being uncomfortable, because a lot of times, right, and we've seen it in the discourse lately with George Floyd's death and sort of this interest in anti-racism in our country. And now sort of the new wave is, I'm tired, this is exhausting. And I'm like, exactly, welcome sort of to the conversation that to care about this and to care about it perpetually takes time, it takes study, it takes messing up, it takes asking questions. But I think if you engage ethically in your advocacy and in your activism or resistance, whatever word you use, then I think that you, more often than not, you will find people, be they Black or otherwise, are supportive and will help you and point you in the right direction. I also think making sure that you're not making assumptions about what we can and can't do or what we will or won't do. Oftentimes, a lot of these questions could be answered by simply asking a question. And then respecting whatever boundaries might be set. So invite somebody to come and be to the book club reading of the latest Ta-Nehisi Coates book. And if they say no, then respect that and then move on. But that doesn't mean to stop the work. But I think more importantly, we have to be able to. Dr. Frank W. Hale once said that a commitment without cash is counterfeit. And so I think for me, that is where we need to start really thinking that if you're truly committed to this, then what is sort of the capital, the resources that you're investing, not only to do your own work, but then to do it with other people. And finally, making sure that you're not seeking anything in return for this work, even if that's just an audience and applause, right? There is always some white person you could be talking to. It might be someone in your own family at Thanksgiving. And so I think oftentimes we want to jump right to the socio-cultural macro level disruptions when you're living in a house with people who have these problematic sort of ideals and the ways that they approach their work. I mean, we've seen it lately on the national landscape. People are like, well, this candidate is terrible for president. That candidate is terrible for president. I'm not engaging, but not engaging in local politics. And you're not going to your school board meeting, not going to the Board of Regents or Board of Trustees meeting. Like, there are things that folks can do, but I think we have to sort of reorient ourselves around sort of what's the most helpful. And so I think asking that question and then listening and believing what the response is, because Black folks will tell you when you're doing the most or when you ain't doing enough. And so I think being able to just be comfortable with the discomfort that comes along with that will sort of get you a long way. So that's just my 2 cents around that.
I think you raise a good point. When we think about the question of this session around what is whiteness, and whiteness is never having to be wrong, right? It is never having to feel this sense of wrongness, always expecting to get the right answer so that when you're told by a Black colleague, nope, or, you're going about this the wrong way, or, don't come for me in private and not advocate in public, like all of these things. I think it really, it's sort of a watershed moment for many white people to realize, and a lot of this work for white people is not being right. And acknowledging what it means to be wrong or to be told you're not doing something right. So we are close to our ending time. And I want to, just thank you all for the knowledge and the information and the critical perspectives that you've shared. I've done this work for a long time, and there's always room to learn more. And I can, wholeheartedly say that I've learned more by being in conversation and being in community with you. So I want to just make a couple of announcements. One, thank you to the audience that has stuck with us throughout this time. But I want to invite those who are listening in to sign up for part 2 of this conversation, which is next Wednesday, July 15th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern, where we'll dig even deeper with a different set of panelists and focus on our next question. And the next question is, dear white people, what is the role of white people in dismantling whiteness in education and challenging anti-Blackness? And in addition, just a reminder that today's panelists will also receive an evaluation. And so if you have feedback for us, I believe one of those pieces of feedback is, can we get a resource list, because they were naming off people and I've never heard of these people. And so we will try to get that up on our college website. But please do complete it, provide your feedback. Please encourage others to come. As a College of Education and Human Ecology, this is our opportunity to really engage in a national conversation and a national educational moment. And so we welcome more to the conversation. And I just want to say to Dr. Venus Evans-Winters, to Dr. TJ Stewart, and to Dr. LaGarrett King, thank you so much for participating in this conversation. We really appreciate you. So thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and hopefully we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.